So we're live. Okay, excellent. So a very good afternoon, or good morning, I guess, if you're joining from Brazil. And welcome to this seminar in the Brazil in the World series, but it's also the Changing World series, the Rising Powers in the World series, because we're going to hear about global India and global China as well as global Brazil. We're delighted to welcome back a long-standing friend of IDS, one of the foremost scholars of South-South cooperation, currently working with the Igarapé Institute in Brazil, but also a co-founder of Articulação Sul, one of Brazil's leading think tanks on South-South cooperation, former director of the Brazil Studies program at Oxford. What else should I mention, Laura? Generally eminent and wonderful person, Laura Trajber Waisbich. So Laura has a book, which she's going to tell us about. This book. Have you got any of those vouchers that allow people to buy it with a discount? No?
I'm only given this one single copy displaying here.
Oh, okay. So you can kind of look but don't touch at the book. But there is an ebook version purchased by the University of Sussex Library, so students here can access that, and it's highly recommended. I should have introduced myself. My name is Alex Shankland. I'm a fellow in the Power and Popular Politics cluster, and I coordinate the IDS Brazil initiative focused on deepening and broadening our partnerships with Brazil. And I'm also delighted that we have with us as a discussant another leading scholar of South-South cooperation, my colleague Lidia Cabral, co-leader of the Rural Futures cluster here at IDS. And so after Laura has spoken for about 40 minutes, do we think?
Yeah, I can even...
Yeah, 30 to 40 minutes. Then Lydia will share some initial reflections, and we will then open it up and welcome a lively, engaged discussion. For people joining online, please put your comments and questions in the chat. And Kieran is monitoring the chat and will collect the questions for us to share with Laura. So, without more ado, over to you, Laura. Welcome back to IDS.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Lydia. I mean, I'm not going to lie if I say that this is one of the most special moments of this book tour, if I can call it like this. Yes, I am a South-South cooperation scholar. I'm both a scholar and a practitioner. I have been doing this for quite a while, and the book we're going to be talking today is certainly part of my journey as this hybrid person. But as they say, it takes a whole village to accomplish a book or a PhD, and you are certainly part of my village. I cannot think about this reflection of IDS, and I'm very glad to be here. So I thought about this conversation and really thought about it, the book launch as a conversation. The reason for that is because even though, yes, it's a book and reflects a certain time and space and my own thinking around South-South cooperation, the world has changed so much, and this field of development cooperation is changing so much that I thought it was a missed opportunity not to reflect on how a book like this can help us navigate the shifting sands. And also, how can we also build this collective understanding of what's happening? So this is really an opportunity for us to talk. My book is just there. And thanks again. Let me then introduce, what I'm going to do is that I'm introducing the book and then placing it in this context, which I'm going to emphasize again and again. It's changing. Give you some flavor of what is there in the book, and then open a discussion about what I think are insights or implications for the changing world. So as I was saying, I'm both a scholar and a practitioner in this field of South-South cooperation. Part of that journey was done in Brazil. The other part was done here in the UK in multiple institutions, in partnerships with multiple institutions and networks, including IDS. And this book comes out of a conversations with many other books that were published in the past 10 years or so, if I can put it like this, that were reflecting on what many call the re-emergence of South-South cooperation, or the boom or the golden era of South-South cooperation in the 2000s, early 2000s. And in particular, the critical thinking that came from the 2010s onwards, and people in this room are part of that conversation. I think you recognize some of those covers. And this book, or my book, gets into that conversation about the consolidation of South-South cooperation coming out of this puzzle. That was a political puzzle, a scholarly puzzle, a citizen puzzle to me. The puzzle of how can we understand the role and the responsibilities of Southern countries, in particular the big Southern countries, and how different stakeholders saw these roles and responsibility differently, and all the disputes that came about trying to understand their roles and responsibilities in the field. So let me just bring you to a conversation. I just took two different extracts, which I think are revealing or illustrative of this diverging expectations around roles and responsibilities of Southern countries in this field. The first one is a extract from a piece published by the commentator Moisés Naim in Foreign Policy magazine back in 2009, in which he says, and I'm going to quote, "In recent years, a variety of wealthy, non-democratic regimes have begun to undermine development policy through their own activist aid programs. Call it rogue aid. It's development assistance that is non-democratic in origin and non-transparent in practice. Its effects is typically to stifle real progress while hurting average citizens." That was Moisés Naim. I'm being provocative here, bringing this, and you're going to understand why I did so. Second quote here is from 10 years later, when the Group of 77 at the United Nations, during the UN high-level conference on South-South cooperation, also known as BAPA plus 40, issued the statement saying, and I'm going to quote here, "We acknowledge the voluntary, participative, and demand-driven nature of South-South cooperation, born out of shared experiences and sympathies, based on their common objectives and solidarity. We further recognize that South-South cooperation leads to more diverse opportunities for development and should not be equated nor measured or assessed as official development assistance. We emphasize that the spread of South-South cooperation shall not reduce the commitment of developed countries to reach the 0.7 of their GNIs as their official development assistance to developing countries." So this was the Group of 77. And here's my puzzle, because you see the conflicting narratives around what South-South cooperation is, what are the roles and responsibilities, who has to pay for this global challenge. And looking at the politics of accountability and responsibility in South-South or Southern-led development cooperation became a research agenda to me. And so I just want to take you to the broader agenda, which I think kind of permeates and embeds this book. And this broader agenda around accountability and responsibility in South-South cooperation, I divided it into three overlapping dimensions or layers. The first one is to look at the politics of international accountability and responsibility of Southern powers or Southern countries in international development. And this international dimension speaks to disputes over donorship norms, what is a good donor, what a good donor does, how it behaves, targets and contribution, how do we define them, but also the measurement of Southern-led development cooperation, measurement of flows, measurement of impacts. This is the first layer. The second layer, which I combine in my thinking and my research, is the domestic accountability and responsibility politics. So disputes over foreign policymaking, South-South cooperation policymaking, and inside those countries, in different countries. And you're going to see in my book, I end methodologically, I had to choose some countries, and I chose Brazil, India, and China, but one can have the same kind of questions elsewhere. It's not limited to those three countries that I've chosen. The third dimension that it's also a kind of layer for analysis is social accountability. And here I'm looking at disputes over citizen oversight, over participation, and over mobilization in the context of South-South cooperation, both at home and abroad. And this one, so if the first layer is really international, the second one, one can frame it as domestic. The third one is really transnational because it cuts across all these two levels. And even though, yes, it's a research agenda around South-South cooperation or more broadly around development cooperation, I really think that it provides a window into broader questions. They're both relevant to international politics or international relations, policy, public policy studies, and development studies. Questions around the politicization of foreign policy or development policy globally and inside these countries, Brazil, India, and China in my case, but also questions around the politics of foreign policy making or development policy making, and the unfolding disputes over the shifting global roles. And then finally, questions around, and this is where I want to take us eventually further in the final part of the conversation, questions around shifting global governance and shifting dynamics of socialization, integration, and differentiation in global governance. And here I'm going to quote a lot of concepts that IR scholars put forward, like a post-Western world, or a multiplex world, or a deeply plural world, or even a fragmented, turbulent world. And so these are the broader questions that I think this book can help us, trying to navigate. Very briefly on methodological strategies, because I know we are in academic institutions. Maybe people here are thinking about developing their own studies. As I said, I took Brazil, global India, global China as my emblematic sites for inquiring about Southern powers in international development. I look them as donors, in inverted commas, or partners, as they like to call themselves, or providers of development cooperation. So I look them acting abroad. But I really rely on multi-level and multi-sited data collection. So I did over 150 interviews, 30 participant observations in Brazil, India, in UN spaces, in minilateral spaces like the BRICS, the G20, and really trying to get this multi-level analysis going. And what I want to emphasize here before I go into a bit more into the context and the findings of the book is how important to me was to work comparatively. Even though, yes, I'm Brazilian, most of my thinking has come, positionality-wise, my thinking has come as someone that works in Brazil. I also had the fortune of engaging with partners in India and China, and to me it was really important to think about these countries in a comparative and relational way. They occupy similar positions in these hierarchies of global development, even though they're different. They have different regimes, they have different trajectories, they have different foreign policy histories and priorities, but there was a value in thinking about them comparatively. In a way, also normalizing all of them. No one, there is no exceptionalism in that sense. It is possible to think about, commonalities and differences. And in particular, that's probably almost like a political stance in here, or epistemological stance. I wanted to do it because there is so much importance given to difference and to the ways in which each of these countries not only think that what they do is very different from traditional aid, but also because they really think that what they do is very different from each other. And so it was important for us to engage with that difference in a comparative, methodologically sounding way. So what I do in the book finally is, and this is what you're going to see here, the moment that you read it eventually, is to map these arenas of conflict over Southern powers, duties and expected behavior in this field of development cooperation, and over whether and how the power holders in this country, they're different, have different characteristics, are called to justify and are held responsible for what they do in the field of development cooperation. And let me go a bit. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to tell you a bit more about the context and how I'm placing those responsibility and accountability disputes within a shifting context, both within rising powers and globally. And then I'm going to just show you very briefly what else is in the book, and then I open for broader implications if I think I still have time. So let me further contextualize this exercise of mapping South-South cooperation, accountability, and responsibility politics by saying that I place this emergence of those disputes in conversation with two overlapping phenomena. The first one is a shift in donorship and development cooperation politics, and this has been going for at least 20 years, at least since the early 2000s. And this is it's a shift in aid as such. Following a growing aid fatigue, a sense of there's something happening in this field, we are moving towards either post or beyond aid. And this is a conversation that has been happening for at least 20 years, or if you want to, maybe between 15 and 20 years. So this is not new. It's not about Trump necessarily, even though Yes, there's something very specific that is happening right now, and I'm going to talk about it. But there is a sense of the field is changing. And the field is changing partially due to internal dynamics of countries that belong to OECD TAC, the traditional donors, and partially by the rise of other countries that were challenging certain norms, certain expectations, and also coming up with their own reformist or revisionist agendas in terms of what is development cooperation, what is a donor, even if they don't call themselves donor, they were playing the kind of donorship game. And those challenges brought by Southern countries were characterized by us and our colleagues as either the BRICS effect or Beijing consensus or Southernization of development, or even mutual socialization, convergence and divergence. And I tend to like this one characterization of we're living in a moment of diffusion, fusion, and confusion in terms of shifting expectations and circulating norms around development corporations, norms and practices. And it's important, and I'm pointing this and really emphasizing the fact that these things were there for at least 15, 20 years, because these trends got even more acute or radicalized or accelerated in the past 2 years. And I think you wake up in 2025 and you cannot stop thinking about the dismantling, the radical dismantling of this field, not only due to Trump shutting down US aid, but also the severe cuts in budget, aid-related budget, or the political attacks and political narratives in regards to development cooperation everywhere across OECD countries. But it's important to place this more radical phase of dismantling in conversation with what's going on, what was going on previously, which here again, I'm talking about a shifting donorship politics, right? The second phenomenon that I think it's important to understand the responsibility and accountability politics in this book is what I also call the politicized consolidation of South-South cooperation within big countries, including India's and Brazil's and China's and others. Many of us, including Lydia here, for instance, have discussed the poorly institutionalized landscape of development cooperation within these countries for very long. But what we see from the mid-2010s is a real effort in these countries to try to make some sense in terms of public policy, creating a field, developing capacity, institutional capacities for these countries to become the kind of providers they became, which meant in the Chinese case, for instance, the creation of a development agency that was not there, before as such in 2018. In the Indian case, also 2015, the creation of a development agency. In the Brazilian case, it was already there since '87, but then a reform in terms of the ways in which this agency operates. And I'm not even here assessing whether or not it was accomplished, what happened to this institutional landscape. But I think the point is, it's really a changing landscape of trying to give some political and policy sense to the work of being a global actor in international development. And this is this is the moment when disputes, negotiation, bargains around this role emerge within these countries. And also this is the moment where a somewhat duty to justify policy options, flows, impact, also emerging these countries in their own ways. And this is exactly the gap that I think it was an interesting gap to address, and the gap that I'm arguing that there are disputes that are emerging in these countries because of this policy consolidation. To make sense of those disputes, I try to look at accountability, responsibility, but mostly accountability in this field of development cooperation as a soft and sticky norm. Because once you come as in between inverted commas, donor in this field, you are already operating in a field that has expectations of how donors behave. And this is interesting because those expectations deal with counting, reporting, and measuring flows. And here we think about OECD TAC metrics and the whole system, the series of platforms and tools, most of them digital tools today to render public development cooperation flows. but also the set of narratives, the political justification, the purpose of aid, that it's there, and also the responsibilities, the duties, the commitments, the targets politically agreed, such as the 0.7 ODA target that in countries like the UK became national law. In other countries, they were never fully accepted, like the US, but in some countries they're referred to, and some countries keep meeting these targets, although this is a minority. Most of the countries never actually met the 0.7. But there are other soft norms, like do no harm. This is how all the multilateral development banks and financial institutions operate. So these are traveling models for me in my book. And they're traveling south the moment that southern countries become more active in this space. But there's something else happening. And there is an encounter between those traveling models and the responses of southern actors. And these responses, I look through the lenses of Southern agency, the ways in which Southern actors, state and non-state, are negotiating those norms. What are their responses? And I think this is very important because even though, again, it seems like I'm speaking about South-South cooperation and development cooperation, but it's really important for other realms of international life as well. These negotiations of newcomers, new actors, and old powers are taking place in climate, in health, in other sectors, in security. And in a way, the contestations around role and responsibility are about development cooperation, how you do development, and what is an expected good donor, but also about the contestations in this shifting global governance, in this post-Western world, multipolar world, in a hyper-politicized relationship between the so-called newcomers and China more than the other ones. But not only China, right? Brazil and India and others would also face that kind of contestation in a shifting world. And these are the moments where I think that questions around accountability or the lack of accountability of these countries became interesting. So just to give you a sense of what else is in the book, I'm not going to tell you more, so at least you feel invited to read. In trying to navigate those traveling models and the Southern responses in this politicized or polarized landscapes, both at home and abroad, what I do, I mean, besides doing a bit of conceptualizing as much as I could in first chapters 1 and 2. So the first one really tries to understand, as I was telling you right now, accountability and responsibility as research agendas. The second one tries to open up, as I was also trying to do, from the development field to broader questions in international relations, and who is responsible, who is irresponsible, and all of those disputes that are happening across this north-south divide. That kind of explain as well why the things that we see in the development sector, and which I call the paradox of differentiated responsibilities, because one of my arguments here in the book is that Southern powers like Brazil, China, and India try to insert themselves, try to be part of this game of providing development cooperation differently. So it is a differentiated integration. This is not about throwing away the system. This is really about trying to reshape the system or to integrate in a selective manner, in a differentiated manner, and emphasizing and sometimes even overemphasizing how different they are. And in this politics of it, how better they are from, in the rankings of this field, the fact that they try to see themselves as better than the existing development partners. And chapters 3 and 4, what they do is that they try to understand the emergence of the accountability problem. For the first one, chapter 3, looks at this emergence in aid land. So what is the accountability problem for traditional donors? What are the contours? For whom is a problem and in what sense is a problem? And then it does the same thing with South-South cooperation, trying to locate that and then see how much of the problem in aid land was then transferred to these new players, what are the different dimensions. And then chapters 5 and 6, they look into themes. The chapter 5 looks at monitoring infrastructures, the politics of measurement. How do we measure South-South cooperation? What is the purpose? And then the rejection but also innovation and the experimentation of countries in the South trying to create their own metrics, to tell their own stories with their own words and figures. And finally, chapter 6 looks at civil society and the ways in which accountability and responsibility has been contested from below. So let me end. I know we are, yes. Okay, I'm going to do a bit less than that so that we can engage. Let me end with sharing some reflections on here. What I think are insights or implications from this book. Yes, as I was saying, the book sheds light into long-standing symbolic, material, ideational shifts and disputes in development cooperation and in governance, more broadly, global governance, while pointing to some real, and I think very real, Southern powers dilemmas or growing pains. One can even think that maybe what we used to call Southern pains are now universal pains. This idea, for instance, of combining development cooperation as a tool for power, status, recognition, and the imperatives of promoting development or sustainable development at home. How development cooperation, in this case, South-South cooperation, becomes this tool that has to serve multiple purposes, and these purposes are not necessarily aligned, and the narratives that you have to create around in order to justify to many constituencies what you do. Equally important is that the case of, the case of South-South cooperation studied here really illustrate a larger phenomena, the bargains over global public goods. Some people call it differently. You can call it the commons, global challenges. I'm calling here just global public goods. But we see in the field of development, as we see in the field of climate, just think about what happened a couple of weeks ago during COP or the previous COPs, as well climate COPs, what happened during COVID and the ways in which we all had this global challenge. But some parts of the world are able to provide the technical inputs and the technology to produce vaccines. But what happens with the rest? So this whole idea of managing those global challenges or the global public goods, including development as a public good, and discussing those universal or differentiated contributions to these efforts. Who pays what? How do we split the bill? The burden sharing and the naming and shaming of this burden sharing in this particular moment. And I think this is even more important. I mean, it was already there when I started to think about my questions, and I cannot wait. There's no single day that I wake up not thinking about how are we going to solve this puzzle, right? The puzzle of managing our global commons with the institutions we have, with the polarization we have right now. So this brings me to that one concept of common but differentiated responsibilities that was once developed in the environmental regime, and it was brought to the development regime, climate regime as well, which really lies on this idea of fairness, which really recognize that we live in an unequal world, and therefore there are countries should not be doing, they have different capacities, they have different capabilities. This is how the climate regime also evolved in thinking about differentiated responsibilities. So yes, it's about recognizing inequality that is embedded, but what used to work to enable consensus and actually allowed for the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, to be sustained is now a bit rusty. Is not the operationalization of common but differentiated responsibilities is no longer functioning, or question mark, is it functioning? Are we reaching that kind of fairness and and equity that we once aimed for? Are we really considering the shifting power, political, economic dynamics within the South? And here I'm not only saying about big countries in the South and small countries in the South, but also inequality within countries. And whether or not CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities principle, is the right tool to get us going in this fairness and equity dilemma. And then finally, to investigate the accountability and responsibility or irresponsibility dynamics in the current world. And today, if you think about what's happening in the traditional aid system, more and more, it's clear that we are heading towards a post-aid world, whatever that means. And there are some insights in the book that I think can help us, and I'm going to end here because maybe that's a good way for us to discuss, can help us. There's no response, I'm afraid, no response here in the book, how we're going to deal with this context right now. But there are some interesting things that I think the book can help us think with. The first one is, yes, we're facing this uncertainty, but also Southern countries have been, in their own ways, responding to some of these challenges. So while certain countries are backtracking for different political reasons, Southern countries are being responsible in their own way. I'm not saying every single Southern country is being responsible, but there's an interesting role and really a need for us to move beyond the more simplistic binary vision of who is managing the global order and how. And so reframing the whole question of responsibility here in this context of open political dismantling and open attacks to not only global development as a field, but also global governance, multilateral institutions. And so I think my book is interesting right now, right? To rethink who is the whole blame game that was taking place in the past and maybe a new game altogether that it's happening right now. The second thing that might be interesting for us to think is, can we look south in order to understand some of the dilemmas that are taking place right now in countries like the UK or France or the US or all the OECD countries? And my short response would be yes, because Southern countries, as I show in the book, and many of us showed in our research, have been struggling with this, how to justify doing development abroad, how to justify cooperation if you have developmental problems at home. And here I'm going to use this idea of the politics of scarcity. Maybe there was a myth that development aid was all about abundance. Oh, we have so many resources and expertise and technology to give out. Maybe this was a myth. It was never the case. Maybe there was a time where there was a lot of flows in there available. But there is something interesting about politics of scarcity. And how do you craft politically sounding and sustainable narratives to sustain development cooperation when you don't have much? Which might mean you changing the way you do development cooperation, not only the way you narrate, the way you say, but also the way you do. And this has been a dilemma for smaller countries, let's say, and certainly from Brazil. You know, I mean, from the three cases that I look for, I think Brazil is perhaps an interesting case for us to think about the scarcity and the implications of that. And finally, if you think about moving this donorship politics and the way we do development cooperation, something I learned in this house was this idea of mutual learning. And how can we learn with, not only learn from, but also learn with other countries. And this could be in this attempt to trying to find strategic mutuality. Why we do cooperation? Because we need, right? And everyone needs, because development is in transition everywhere. And I'm not here erasing historical responsibilities or diluting differences. I'm just stating that development is in transition everywhere in different ways. And so we probably need something that looks like learning with everywhere. And this could be something that South-South cooperation could inspire us to think about for the current context. And so I think I'm going to end here to open the conversation. Once again, thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to the debate.
Absolutely brilliant, Laura. Thank you so much. And I think it's fair to say that you've shown us why your book is not just interesting in this current moment, but absolutely essential. I think this is an essential lens on some of these really core dilemmas across the world in terms of global public goods, climate, and other issues as well as development. So Lydia, your reflections.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, colleagues online. And yeah, amazing book, Laura. Thank you for writing it. Thank you, Alex, for bringing us together. I should start by saying that it's been some time since I've research South-South cooperation, these topics, although I continue following them from some distance, but it's been a while. So I think your book has given me an opportunity to re-engage with some of these debates. I keep an eye on the topic as I teach a class on South-South cooperation and the changing aid land as part of our teaching program. So perhaps some of you will take that course. It's always very exciting because we have a very international student community, bring many perspectives on what is the South, what is Southernness. So we always have very, very stimulating conversation around this. So thank you for writing an amazing book. I highly recommend, and as Alex said, there's an e-copy already in the library. I think it's amazing how, I think, and your presentation here today confirmed that, how you engage with so many concepts, how you manage to connect so well this topic, which some may think it's a bit dull, development cooperation, South-South cooperation, and so on. But you managed to connect it with really exciting concepts, as well as very hot topics of the moment, including climate negotiations and all sorts of issues that are very, very current. So I think you've done really well doing that. It was really some amazing reflections there. And I really like the way in which you use the CBDR perspective to connect it with some of these dilemmas and identity crisis that you see within the southern providers. I think it is particularly important that you are a Brazilian scholar who's been in this field for a number of years, although you're still young. Not saying anything about that, but I think shows your commitment and the fact that we know that you've circulated in many of the spaces where these discussions are happening, and where different thinking about what it is to be from the South and what contribution that brings to the international debate, just thinking about binaries and beyond binaries. You've been at the core of these conversations, and the book really shows that. I just wanted to, I wanted to make 2 points, but before that, just to say that, so my own position in relation to South-South cooperation, there's been ups and downs. There's been moments where I thought, this is really, there's something in here, including the fact that often you have conversations about own experiences of addressing development challenges, policy, very concrete forms of interaction, whereas you tend not to have that in more sort of conventional aid. Although there's that we've seen in practice, which has been very refreshing. We know also there's a lot of the discourse about the distinctiveness of some of these players, as well amongst themselves, but also in relation to the North, is often overplayed and misleading. So I've had sort of ups and downs in in how I've viewed this field and its shifts. So I wanted to just raise 2 points for discussion. So for the first one is around the CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities paradox, that I think chapter 2 is centrally about, but then you'll come back to throughout, which I think is one of the crucial contributions to this topic. And then my second point is around how you end the book and how you ended your talk around, I guess, a call for consensus building in the field and this social compact that you talk about. So on the first one, I think your argument is very persuasive when you talk about the paradox of common but differentiated responsibilities, the ways in which these countries have been behaving, trying to insist on their difference and how they're part of a counter movement at the same time as trying to be part of that. So you see that very clearly, and the way in which you present that is I think it's very well done. And I agree with you that I think this common but differentiated responsibilities posture does reinforce the binaries in an unhelpful way. And I think you see that more clearly when you then start looking unpacking the country. So in your book, I think in the international relations tradition that I think you were trying to keep a dialogue with that field, right? Of course, you talk about Brazil, China, and India, right? The rising powers. These are sort of, you do have this discussion around the domestic politics, but it's always in relation to the Brazil's international foreign policy, or the Chinese or the Indians, and so on. And I think when you break down this idea of the country, of the unit, of the, this nation state, which of course is represented by governments and ministers of foreign affairs, but within that, what are they representing? They're representing probably a series of very conflicting agendas and interests, right, within their domestic sort of context. And it's when you look into that I think it becomes very visible how this idea common but differentiated is very problematic. And the work that IDS has we, Alex and I, were involved in together with other colleagues, Jens Koens, Jingu, a few years ago. So already a bit dated, I'm sure, but we were trying to unpack this idea of the country and looking at, the complexities, the multiple agendas and interests within countries. And in my own work, I chose to focus then on the agri-food field to identify these different interests. And if you look at a country like Brazil and its agri-food sort of cooperation agenda, you clearly see that there's not one agenda. There's multiple agendas at play that push in very different directions. And the claims by Brazil Foreign Affairs of Southerners are really problematic when you look at how powerful the agribusiness, international, multinational sort of players represented within the Brazilian package. That's nothing to do with Southerners as a counter movement, at least. These are part of international global sort of agribusinesses that may use the Southerners as a sort of as a hand to push forward their interests. Parts of Brazilian agriculture have been part of a hegemonic movement, not part of a counter movement. So, they don't have any sort of, we shouldn't, let them make any claims about Southerners and having different types of responsibilities. They have huge responsibilities when it comes to the sustainability agenda, climate justice, as well as social justice. So I think the CBDR is problematic when you look at it from within specific areas. It can hide these important differences and allow powerful actors to abuse the counter movement claims of Southern governments. I want not to move to the point around consensus, but just before that, it's often said, I'm coming at this from the Brazil agri-food perspective, right? And it's often said in Brazil that, the country is full of contradictions, paradoxes, there's this thing about this, we have our contradictions that then get exported abroad. And I'm more inclined to think that these are not contradictions at all. These are very strategic, opposing political, societal, views of the world, views of well-being, and so on that are, they're not contradictory. They just reflect an increasingly polarized world, which I think you talk about in your book. You talk about strategic ambivalence and this, but I think we need to look at it not from the point of view of contradictions, but from the point of view of conflicting agendas. Because if we see them as contradictions, things that need to be, we might be pushing for a consensus where that consensus may be problematic. So that's my second point, and then I'll end. So you, despite recognizing these tensions, paradoxes, and strategic ambiguity in the ways that the Southern powers negotiate rights and responsibilities, you then end the book with a call for consensus around an international social compact. And I wanted to ask you whether this consensus is at all possible. But more than that, I think you might say that it's not possible because there's many challenges. But what I wanted really to ask you about is whether it is desirable. Because we know, and then again, I'm thinking about the agri-food field. It's a field with many inequalities, structural inequities. So you're never going to have a level playing field. So what does consensus building mean in a context where you have structural inequalities, as I think you've alluded to more generally? Yeah, but perhaps I'll leave you with that. I've been trying to think about this idea of consensus. It was a paper that I wrote for the British Academy a global disorder program where I combine a perspective of justice with Chantal Mouffe's idea of agonistic pluralism, which is not new. It's been around for many, many years. But I think it's still useful because what it suggests is that in a polarized world with inequities, pushing for consensus building might result in exclusion. So then how do we productively work with dissent? And rather than seeking closure, we just work with sort of create the space for opposing political projects to be supported and empowering more those that are less powerful. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you again for a wonderful book and contribution to the field and also I think our teaching program. Thanks you enormously. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Lydia. So I think, Laura, I was going to suggest that we just heard Lydia and then went to the room, but there's a lot there. Would you like to respond, or are you happy to think about it while we take a couple more questions in the room? Because I think there's some deep and important questions that Lydia's posed. How would you like to do it? Would you like to respond now, or would you like to collect a few more things and then respond?
Maybe I will collect, because then eventually I can also connect certain things and keep the conversation with Lydia going, because that was
brilliant. Okay, thank you. So we have a great online audience, and I've seen messages popping up on the screen from Lucinada, from Peter Taylor, our director, from Ijoma, from Leonardo, from In Metro. So various people have come in with online questions, but I think I'm going to come to the room first. So Kieran, if you just remind people online, please put things in the chat, and we'll come to the online contributions very shortly. But let's go to the room first. So I'm going to wander around with the microphone. Oh, you did that? Thank you, Lydia. So yes, okay, we have a question left, Kate, yeah. And then Jerry, yep. It's the red button at the bottom.
No, I don't. Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura. That was really interesting. I look forward to reading the book. So you mentioned, so you were looking at the countries in relation to their activities abroad in other countries. I was wondering, who were your respondents? Were they the providers, the receivers, the people that the donors interact with, or both, a combination of all of those? And linked to that, so sort of whose perspective were you considering the accountability? So you mentioned accountability from below, social accountability. I just would like to hear a bit more about what you mean by those and what that looks like in practice. And maybe finally, were there differences between the countries in terms of maybe the willingness and the openness of your respondents to talk to you, and maybe to be self-critical? Obviously, donors like to present, of all types, like to present themselves well. So how did you kind of sift through that of what's really going on? Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry.
Well, first, Laura, congratulations on doing this and on a great presentation. I guess I work on health, and I have been thinking about this, including post-aid land, as it were. And so I wanted to raise two questions. One is cooperation, the other is South. Now, you're focusing on, by cooperation, it sounds like it's a different form of aid. And so it's part of the charities side. But as we move away from aid, what's going to be much more important is access to low-cost drugs, et cetera, and increasingly, how are you in the cutting-edge technologies, like in health, it's digital health. And a lot of the southern countries are very much seeking markets in the health sector. And Brazil, of course, but very much China and India. And so then there's a question, what form is this trade going to take, or is investment going to take? Is it going to be mainly about national interest in terms of economics, or is there going to be some kind of social responsibility in the form of trade and investment? And then in terms of investment, there's a big push now on cutting edge technologies and new value chains. It's true in climate and energy transition, and it's true in health. And where are Southern countries going to be in their cutting edge technologies? Are they going to try to get intellectual property, control an area, or do they have a different vision of what these value chains will look like? In other words, I think a lot of your research fits very well at going way beyond development assistance, but it would be good to hear how you think it can, because I think, to be honest, I think that's much more important now than the South-South development cooperation. Now, South. The UK has published its development strategy, and we have the aspiration in the UK to be the third country in life sciences after the United States and China. So China's south, but it is now one of the leading countries in the development of new drugs and pharmaceuticals, and may well be in the position to outdo the United States. South. India has a leading IT sector, and is, interestingly, in the G20, say they want to take the lead on digital health. But that isn't just about social benefit. It's also that Indian companies have a good possibility of being leaders in digital health and the application of artificial intelligence. So again, what is the thinking in terms of South-South in terms of these leading edge sectors? And what do we mean by South when at least two of the Southern countries are becoming key global players in international markets? And I guess, and how can you extend your analysis really to this changing world where we're not just beyond aid land, but we're beyond the easy definition of South trying to catch up and the North in the lead?
Thanks. Yes, please. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Like you mentioned that that your book helps with this question of, can we look to the South to identify, challenges in the North? And you say yes, that, that the South has tried to justify, how to do development despite not having development problems, despite having development problems at home itself. And so, what are the ways that, that Southern countries have tried to emulate, a new approach to development that does not rely on aid, which seems to, not only solve the issue of politics of scarcity, but also provide an alternative to aid in the incoming, post-aid world that would also, simultaneously place Southern countries at the forefront of that, of that post-aid world, or, or could that South-South cooperation just result in a continuation of colonialist tendencies by these growing power players in that region, whether it's Brazil, whether it's China, whether it's India? And to that extent, how might those smaller or marginalized countries try to hold those power players accountable?
Thank you. Yes, another question there. Yeah.
I have a question about the cooperation. I understand that the importance of South-South cooperation, and also I would like to know from your analysis about what do you think about the role of North? For example, I'm from Japan. I would like to know what I don't know North or so what would be the like, for example, Japan or other countries could do. And also I have a class. Please, if you could answer.
To answer quickly because you have to leave. You have classes. Okay. It is being recorded, but yes. So do we have any more questions in the room? One more.
Sorry. I'm from Brazil, and I want to know your opinion about how our approach in South-South and cooperation changed with the shift in power, because we saw that a lot in the last 10 years, and maybe we'll see it more next year. So what is your opinion, please?
Great. So how do you feel? I think we do have some great questions online as well, but would you like to have a go at answering those? And then we'll take the online questions, and I also have a couple I'll throw into the mix if there's time. Okay. So yes, Laura, over to you.
I will never do justice to the debate, but I think also what was said here informs the conversation later on, because there's just a lot and very interesting comments. Let me start with, well, first of all, the reason why I really like the village IDS is because, I mean, these people are also my mentors, my own. I'm like sitting next to Alex and Lydia, people with whom I thought about those things and learned very much. So I think it was evident from from your comments that that it's really wonderful to be part of that dialogue. But going into what you said, I think part of the traditional intellectual tradition or school of thought that I try to insert myself, which is critical South-South cooperation studies, has in many ways tried to make it visible all of these, here I'm going to use contradictions, but also the abuses, right? How the narrative of South-South cooperation was concealing inequalities or concealing many power agendas, were also overplaying difference, was probably also using, not unlike traditional powers, was using a softer part of the big umbrella of South-South relations to advance other interests, and sometimes concealing them by having a neater or polished or sanitized discourse, and overemphasizing the transformative potential of South-South cooperation. To assert themselves, to create new markets, to improve and strengthen relationships. And that has been the role of this field, critical South-South cooperation studies, some of which actually went to the very micro bilateral relations. And many people here in this house has discussed Brazil-Mozambique ties, for instance, in showcasing those. So I think you're very right when you say that in many ways, all of the Southern powers have abused the expectations around South-South cooperation being a counter movement, a counter wave to traditional aid. What is interesting is that expectation was never shared with the whole overall community. Many actors, governmental and non-governmental within aidland, never wanted South-South cooperation to be transformative or to challenge aidland. Some did. Some actually thought it was very refreshing, as you said, and in a way there was and has been a kind of an interesting conversation between critical voices within aidland and voices in South-South cooperation, in the South-South cooperation land, because of that kind of critical take. And maybe South-South cooperation was not the response, but it was leading us to closer to certain things that were dear to the critical thinkers in here, including the very idea of national ownership. The very idea of, sometimes people frame it as horizontal cooperation. I know it's a funny way of putting it in English, but more equal relations. And I think this has been the very idea of partnership has been, it was eventually even co-opted afterwards, but it was central to critical thinkers in aidland and also to the discourse of South-South cooperation. Whether or not this happens in practice, I think it's really sector-specific, country-specific, sometimes even initiative-specific. I think we do have, because we circulate as practitioners as well, I think we do see some very inspiring, refreshing things. But this is not unique to South-South cooperation. End of the day, it can happen also in aidland. So I agree with you, and I think it's very interesting that you use the example of the agri-food sector and the multinationals, because that's very clear this was happening. There is part of the Chinese or the Indian package. They're also very much about exporting their own companies and services and technologies. What is interesting about South-South cooperation, and maybe the same could be said about the South, and what I do in this book is that I'm not questioning whether it is or is not. I'm using the umbrella that is given by the official narrative of how they see themselves, why they frame themselves as Southern countries, why they want to put forward something that is South-South cooperation, why China has moved from calling it what it did, aid, and started to use the label development cooperation or South-South cooperation, why Modi is so insisting on India's role as a Southern, as a leader of the Southern world, right? And when India was hosting the G20 back in 2022, it decided to host in parallel a summit, the summit of the Global South Voices. So why this label is sticky, to me, was more interesting than whether or not it is real or, which I think then poses problems, as you were saying, Jerry, it does makes us think what then the label is concealing. And I have to say, and back to the politics of metrics and the technical political decisions, China is still and India are still developing countries. You can call it developing. And then the reason why they use South is a geopolitical, no, it has a geopolitical and historical reason why the South is there. But they are technically, China is technically second world economy and developing countries. This might be reaching its limit, right? Very soon, but in per capita terms, it's still a developing countries. So this is the World Bank. This is the metrics that we decided. And maybe going beyond GDP and going beyond all of those metrics would allow us to think about development differently. So I really think that what is interesting, and maybe back to my point about thinking development transition everywhere, India can be that hub of IT technology, cutting edge technology, but also a country where access to electricity, access to many of the what we call the basic service, wash, water, sanitation, is just so poor. It's so unequally distributed. So yes, it will be cutting edge, islands of cutting edge technology, a bit like China still or Brazil. And I wonder whether, and that's why it's interesting to think about those questions also in relation to the North, is that inequalities is hitting the richer countries in a way that certainly we are facing those developmental challenges while having islands of cutting edge technology. But I think you're right, we have to go beyond easy definitions. And what I do in the book is that I also try to problematize the use of the South, particularly when it comes to shielding responsibility or avoiding responsibility. And in a more kind of political note, I think every single country in the G20 right now should not be using the CBDR the same way. Maybe this club of the big economies of the world should, and there might be, Lydia, to your point, there might be a way that we could redefine and find some consensus about a new social pact, and that would go beyond the original North-South binaries, but is about the photography of the power, material, and political power configurations of today's world. The G20 has defined itself as a table of the richest countries, but also those that have a better or more privileged say in world affairs. Well, if you are in that table, then you cannot claim CBDR, right? And this is valid for China, is valid for India, is valid for Brazil. I think bridging with the climate conversation as well, it's very hard to see Brazil claiming that differentiated responsibility while being the fifth emitter of, I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard to reconcile those. Yes, there is the per capita. Yes, we can discuss metrics again, and the blame game that we established. But I think there could, I really enjoy you bringing the philosophers, political philosophers in the room with Chantal Mouffe. I don't want to sound like I was trying to find that consensus or erase and dilute conflict, but maybe that was just more the political need that thinks that we have to find a way to really signify cooperation. There must be a way that allows us to think about inequality and to think about how can we learn with each other. Yes, there will still be markets and still be cutting edge technology, and access to market will be part of the South-South cooperation agenda. But countries in the foreign policy of countries like Brazil, India, and China, their global roles have been permeated, but all of those is not one single purpose. And maybe that was another myth of aid, as if there was one single purpose, it was charity. It was never the case. And we fooled ourselves by saying that it is the development purpose of aid. Yes, it's there alongside the political purpose of aid, the geopolitical purpose of the access to market purpose of aid. And I think South-South cooperation carries the kind of multi-dimensional purpose agenda as well. I was trying to pick up on different questions, but maybe let me just say something about
the role of the North.
The role of the North, South-South reproducing traditional asymmetries. I think I already made the point that yes, it does. And electoral politics, which then allows me to speak about the differences between the countries. Many people disencourage me to work with Brazil, India, and China, not only because it's hard to work with like big countries, but also because of the political regime. And then obviously there was the elephant in the dragon in the room. This like, why are you comparing China, completely different regime? And what I had to do was to think about how the regime variable meant to my research in terms of the concepts and the analysis, but also what it meant to my fieldwork. And so I interviewed, and I say that in the book, my book looks at southern providers from their own perspective. I mostly interviewed people that were in China, in Brazil, and in India, but my access to do, wait, before that, most of my interviewees are from these countries. A minority is from other countries and their perspectives on these 3 countries. And these other countries or experts could be located in both in the south or in the north. But in the case of Brazil, I had a variety of stakeholders that were willing to talk to me. And in most of the cases, with a lot of this kind of, let's reflect together, let's take this opportunity to reflect together about what we do. Whereas this happened a bit in India, and I had a mix of governmental and non-governmental and experts. And in China, I had no official representative. I had academics and people from associations, non-governmental organizations. So it is different. I never actually spoke. I mean, in my interviews, there is no official Chinese bureaucrat, but there are many experts that are actually working for governmental organizations, and they had a say on the official policies as well. Finally, on electoral politics, the role of the North. Oh, just to connect, the regime matters because electoral politics were a central part of the accountability and responsibility dynamics I was observing in Brazil due to the radical shifts in this past 10 years, as you were saying. But it was not the case in India, which successively elected the same party again and again and again. So the electoral, yes, there was an electoral factor, but Modi was re-elected for 3 times. 2 times, so the 3rd term. And this has made almost, in the Chinese case, there was no power transition in that sense. It's very much the consolidation of Xi Jinping in his own view with a more assertive foreign policy. In the Indian case was a shift, but it's almost like a shift of consolidation of BJP's vision for India over time. And in the Brazilian case, the electoral politics were so part of the accountability politics because questioning the priorities of Brazil in foreign policy in general, but in South-South cooperation, the role of the so-called South in Brazilian foreign policy was very much the agenda that the opposition wanted to challenge the Workers' Party. So it is central to Brazil, is less central to India and China, but doesn't mean that there are not other types of accountability playing out. It's just that this electoral one is very central in Brazil and less so elsewhere, in my book, at least. Yes. Japan. She left. I think even though I keep emphasizing South-South cooperation, the role of the South, I think partially we need to go beyond those labels and boundaries. To me, to put it back to where we are in the current, December 2025, I think the North or the traditional donors, OECD DAC members, should really be doing some self-searching reflections of what is the role of their development cooperation in a changing world. What I find it problematic right now is, why do you conflate? There are 2 things that are happening. One is to question whether development aid as charity was serving anything, whether to question the amount of finance that was going to alleviate specific problems that people in countries like this one are not seeing as you're not seeing the interdependence link. Maybe people are more convinced by global issues like climate change or health pandemics, less convinced about transferring taxpayers' money to help strengthening a particular health system in a particular country that it's completely, they perceive this confined to, that's a local problem elsewhere. But I think this could be an opportunity for the North, so-called North, to reconsider cooperation, but also global engagement. We shouldn't be conflating international cooperation with aid. There are many ways one can cooperate with others, right? Back to Jerry's question. And so I really think the role of the North needs to be engaging with the multilateral system, with other countries. And you can engage in a very strategic, instrumental way. I'm only engaging when I really see the purpose of what I'm gaining. That's fine. You know, there are ways to do cooperation in a very pragmatic, instrumental way. But there's also the nature of technology transfer that is part of international cooperation. And I really think that social technology or cutting edge technology, there's a role for that. And yeah, I don't know if I responded our colleague very well, but to me, the key is engaging internationally, right? Development cooperation or cooperation more broadly.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So online, I think, Kieran, first of all, we have some congratulatory comments from friends. So Lucinada, parabéns, congratulations, very interesting and necessary.
I love.
And then Ijomaladele, very insightful and thought-provoking. Jennifer Constantine, super parabéns, can't wait to read the book and continue the conversation. And thanks for a thought-provoking discussion. Peter has pointed out, has a question, but he's also made a comment, which is that the book is quite good value on Kindle, given the eye-watering cost of the hardback. So I think there's a kind of inequity, and there's a set of arguments about the publishing industry there. So we have a couple of questions from Peter and also from Leonardo from InMetro in Brazil, and also from Leslie Chan. So Peter says, again, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Your points about accountability are really well made, but if you're trying to make real progress beyond aspirational words towards greater accountability, how do you deal with the challenge of the preference of many funders to maintain their sense of a status quo? How do you break the impasse? Leonardo has some questions about Brazilian cooperation. So how do you see Brazilian international development policy during the current Lula administration, Lula 3? And then how do you see the main constraints and opportunities to advance Brazilian cooperation policy? And then Leslie again says broad-ranging, far-reaching research, congratulations. You refer primarily to state actors. What roles do you see for transnational corporations, particularly big techs, and their influence on state policies, and thus potentially on SSC? And I will just toss into the mix a couple more because you haven't had enough questions. So I was intrigued by, you mentioned the question of historical responsibilities. And I think the fact that CBDR transitioned from the environment and climate debate into the development debate is not accidental, because in climate policy, you have the debate around historical accumulations. And in development policy, you have the role of the debate around colonialism and historical responsibility for colonial regimes. To what extent does the denial of the past, if you like, that is prevalent among many right-wing governments and or ascendant movements in the global north, the refusal to discuss, the British Empire as a source of some of the current global inequalities, the refusal in a Make America Great Again movement to discuss the role of the US in perpetuating global injustices and so on. So to what extent does the rightward shift in politics and the fact that it's often accompanied by a refusal to engage with critical reflection on the past make it harder to have a CBDR approach? In other words, to take historical responsibility seriously, because if that goes, what then is the foundation? If we're not talking about reparations, what are we talking about? We're not talking about aid as charity, and if we're not talking about aid as reparations, what are we talking about, is the question in relation to CBDR. And then I was wondering also, in terms of your timeline, so you mentioned the politics of scarcity. Is it fair to say that in the same way that relative poverty and perceived income inequality is more politically salient in many contexts than absolute. To what extent does the post-2008 continued rise, particularly of China and Brazil, but also other leading powers of the global South, when the global North was acquiring a new sense of scarcity? To what extent is it not that there's just, it's not about an absolute scarcity of resources in the global North, it's about a perception of the shift in the distribution of resources and the fact that many major powers of the global South continue to grow very rapidly after 2008-9, whereas the North staggered, as it were. So I'll throw those two into the mix. And again, thank you for, such a fascinating and stimulating presentation and discussion. And thanks everyone for the great questions so far.
Ooh. I'm going to go a bit of reverse order here. Well, you might have a point here about the politics of scarcity more perceived than real, but the effects are very real in a sense of, yes, and every time someone that was born and lived in the South, for very long, such as myself, comes to the North, you sometimes feel like, wait, we are coming from completely different discussions on inequality. And I think what is interesting is what's happening or deprivation. What's happening is a mirror that has been put in front of OECD DAC countries to say, look, you have to face growing poverty at home. You have to face growing inequality at home, which is not to say that there is abundance and there is a lot of resources still, and even the room for maneuver, the fiscal room for maneuver comparatively with countries that live in other structural inequalities and heavily indebted countries with other asymmetrical relations to global capitalism. So it's not the same to say that, inequality is rising in the West or in OECD DAC countries, that we've reached a kind of a convergence towards, unequal societies everywhere, and that inequality is equal everywhere. So there are interesting things, but I think what is important is, as you said, and I think you're right, the perception was fueling other political ideas, and these political ideas are very important in public debate. And so I always like to think about those surveys about public opinion. How much do you think your country gives us foreign aid or development aid? And people would say 20% of budget is, man, these countries are not reaching the 0.7. So no, we're completely off in terms of the perception. And I think this is interesting because it is then exploited by certain political forces that were that have more this kind of isolationist vision of their world, their role in the world. So I think this is, I don't know if that's what you've meant, but I think this is a very important point. And tying to what I said before, my book is not really about assessing, and I'm going to try to respond to Peter Taylor, but my book is not really the normative book about, even though I like accountability as also the normative agenda, I'm not assessing here whether or not they were more or less accountable. I was assessing why accountability became a problem and why we should discuss it. And then further on, either myself doing my consultant practitioner studies or other people can assess whether these projects are more accountable, whether horizontal relationships were forged, what are the developmental outcomes, what are the spaces for participation, transparency. I'm not doing that in this book, but I'm raising the questions of, what became salient, as you said, politically salient, what parts of that accountability agenda became salient and what parts didn't. And so when you think about, just to give an example, parts that didn't, back to the big umbrella of South-South cooperation and how so many different things are there inside this big umbrella. The world of policy banks in China in India and in Brazil, it's a very visible role of what South-South cooperation is, and the impacts of policy banks that are actually providing loans, and then these loans are either to export services for big infrastructure projects or for big investment, including in extractive industries. This is a very visible part of the agenda that then generates a lot of civil society mobilization to contest. I mean, are you behaving just like the others? You're providing loans for like dirty businesses or for environmental impact, social, I mean, dislocating entire populations. You spend, I mean, you southern countries spend years and decades trying to change the World Bank for doing exactly that. And look at you, you are just repeating. This is a very visible part of the accountability discussion. And we've seen a lot, I mean, a lot of debates around that, which then would question also the policy options, including when projects were dirty projects in terms of environment or climate. And so the environmental movements in India or China could look at the global China and global India and criticize through these environmental lenses, including showing the contradictions of that policy discourse. I want to forge the ecological civilization in the Chinese context, and still, you know, while selling a lot of renewable green tech, investing in projects that had environmental problems, including coal power plants elsewhere. So a very interesting debate. That's why I said it speaks about policy coherence in foreign policy and the politics of foreign policy, because actors in there were trying to, Peter, if you allow me to say that, I think this is a part of the accountability game. Accountability is not either you have it or you don't. I see it as a process. And the process of engaging power holders in questioning policy decisions leads us to eventually, in a normative sense, better policy outcomes in the future. You know, and I think looking at China again, I think China has learned a lot about how to be this global player. Are we there yet in terms of what it should be? No, I don't think so. I mean, and that's my personal opinion, normative opinion. And we see a lot of, you know, dependency and asymmetries and environmental damage everywhere. But I think they're learning in terms of what can they put there, which ties to another question that someone asked me before. I think China is doing more of the technology transfer that it used to be doing, that it used to do, because it realized that if it was only about investments, extractive in nature of highly asymmetrical, it could not sustain. It would repeat a pattern that we know it's unsustainable. And so China is embedding little by little some kind of technology transfer components or training components in Africa, in Latin America, which means we might be, maybe half full glass, we might be in a position where the dominant force of today's world is a bit more sensitive to the costs of highly unequal relationships than the previous countries were.
So that may speak to Leslie's question about the role of tech and tech companies, including, for instance, Chinese AI companies in state policy and SSC.
Yeah, although I have to say that the big tech is a sector that I understand very poorly. What I can say from the Chinese part of the conversation, I mean, certainly this is not a topic that it's big in Brazilian South-South cooperation, but it is very much so in the Chinese one, and it's growing in the Indian one as well. I think this is where cooperation will be going in this bigger umbrella of a lot of things fit into the umbrella of South-South cooperation, and big tech is one of the bets, you know, Chinese bets alongside renewable. I mean, and it's interesting, you know, from big projects, China is now in the small is beautiful type of project, and the tech, it's included in this 3.0, near 2.0 thinking, including BRI right now is not the physical connectivity, but also the digital connectivity. So that's probably where we're gonna see more, and I think people like Leslie have more to say than I do in this field. Do we have another
So finally, we have Leonardo asking, so we have 2 minutes, so no problem, very easy question.
But Brazil
International
Lula
development policy under Lula 3 and constraints and opportunities to advance Brazilian development cooperation.
It's interesting, back to the electoral cycle and a big question mark about sustainability. How do you create sustainable discourses that sustain Brazil's international cooperation, but also its relations with the developing world beyond the Workers' Party? Because of Brazilian own electoral dynamics or partisan dynamics, there has been a push to polarize on Brazil's identity as a southern country, as if it was a left-wing agenda or an agenda from the Workers' Party. And it shouldn't be, because Brazil is a developing country, it is a Latin American country. Right now, it's also wants to define itself as a tropical forest country. It was always, right? But it's a matter of defining and labeling it like this, positioning as an international identity. But it's interesting that obviously has implications. The moment that you put yourself out there, defining yourself as developing or prioritizing the diversification of relations with the South, for certain actors and interest groups inside the country, this was about ignoring the North or changing alliances or reducing existing analysis. And some of the groups, because of the conflicts that Lydia was mentioning before, they were just not in favor of that policy choice. So it's not only about narrative and identity politics, it certainly has implications. We see a reconstruction of South-South cooperation right now under Lula 3, just like, Lula 3. I started to speak Portuguese.
Lula 3.0.
Lula 3.0. Just like we saw with attempted reconstructing other public policies after the far-right rule in Brazil. I think whether or not we're going to sustain that is a question mark, because some of the structural bottlenecks were not necessarily addressed. And in Brazil right now, we do have a big problem in terms of the budget and who controls the budget. So if there is a new elected government that happens to be from this more radical version of the far right, it will try to dismantle again, not because it was major, not because it was costing a lot to the Brazilian state, but because it's perceived as a Workers' Party agenda. So in this kind of partisan politics, it will try to dismantle, because the Brazilian South-South cooperation was also about exporting, it was policy-based. It was exporting certain policies. Which policies? The policies that the Worker Party and its own coalition thought were worth exporting. And so a new coalition would say, I wish the new coalition would just say, we're going to export other policies. But actually what happened during Bolsonaro is that they said, we're not going to export policies. We're going to export services and machinery and food and other things. It's not about policy. It was not policy-based. And by the way, yes, we can have relations with the South, but we want to have commercial relations with the South. Nothing that it's encapsulated under the solidarity discourse or cooperation. It's not about cooperation. So yes, there is a renewal of South-South cooperation under Lula. They're bringing back some of the traditional food insecurity agenda, but I see it also an incorporation of the environmental and climate agenda, very much so. It was not present before, and this is because the current government has prioritized that. So you see the Amazon featuring more prominently, forest-related or forest-to-forest country type of cooperation, but also climate resilience within the discussion of food security. So there is a refresh. I mean, there is a new component that it's emerging, and there's a big question mark about Latin America because of the politics of the region as well. I mean, the region is very polarized. So who are you cooperating with in Latin America at this moment? Maybe favoring Amazonian countries rather than the southern cone that used to be more the realm of Brazilian cooperation. I don't know if I responded, just not some ideas out there. I know we
No,
late.
responded wonderfully, Laura. And I think, I mean, I'd like to continue listening to you for many more hours, and I hope we'll have many opportunities soon. But I think, first of all, yeah, thanks again, everyone, for some fantastic questions, for great engagement, both online and in the room. And a huge thank you to Lydia for excellent kicking us off with such an excellent set of discussion points. But I think huge thank you to you, Laura, for coming here and challenging us and inspiring us. Thank you. Many thanks for Kieran for making the tech work. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.